Almost every country in the world has its own capital city. Generally, a country's capital tends to be its best, biggest, and most desirable city to live in. These cities usually attract many people from around the country and abroad. Some examples that spring to mind are London, Paris, or Tokyo. Now, when I said most desirable to live in, I mean in terms of opportunity, not as in quality of life, as often these huge cities can be busy, pricey, and hectic. For some people, life quality isn't particularly great in these cities. However, there are many countries whose capital isn't their biggest, most important, or influential city. Let's take Turkey as our first example. So the capital city of Turkey is Ankara, not Istanbul, which is easily its most populated, iconic city that has a global influence. And to be honest, Ankara is still a huge city, with a population of over 5 million. However, this is only around a third of the size of Istanbul. The GDP of Istanbul is said to be around $350 billion, accounting for around 40% of Turkey's total economy. It is easily the most important city in the country. Australia is another country whose capital is completely overshadowed by another city or cities. The capital Canberra has a population just shy of 500,000, making it the 8th most populated in the country. And although the quality of life in the city is said to be some of the highest in the world, it's not a city many people choose to really visit. It is notoriously known as a very boring city. When people visit Australia, it's certainly not at the top of their bucket list. Canberra is completely overshadowed by cities such as Sydney, which many people may think is its actual capital. It is easily the country's most iconic and famous city. The capital also sits in a rather awkward place. It is around a 3-hour drive from Sydney and 7 hours from Melbourne. It sits slightly inland too, meaning if you were to travel along the coast, you wouldn't pass through it. By metro area, Brazil is home to the world's 7th most populated city, Sao Paulo. The city is also the 2nd most populated in the Southern Hemisphere, with a population of around 22 million. Only Jakarta has a larger population in the Southern Hemisphere. Although the country's most populated city, it is arguably not its most well known. That accolade surely would go to Rio, which actually was the capital until 1960. Rio is not just Brazil's most iconic city, but perhaps one of the most iconic cities in the world. The view of Christ the Redeemer looking over the bay is known across the world by millions. Yet, both of these cities are not the capital, and unless you have some decent geography knowledge, then you perhaps wouldn't know this. The actual capital is Brasilia, which in itself is still a decently populated city, with just shy of 3 million people. Brasilia's main problem is its location. It is found in the heart of the country, far away from any coast and away from its two most important cities. The drive from Rio to Brasilia is around 16 hours. This was no accident, however. The capital was built in its central-ish location to try and promote regional development and national unity. The chosen site was situated in the country's interior on the Brazilian highlands. This was to help alleviate the economic and population pressures that were concentrated in the coastal regions. Morocco is another country whose capital city is completely overshadowed by another city. In this case, it is Rabat and Marrakesh respectively. Marrakesh, which is easily the country's most famous city, isn't even its most populated and actually ranks 4th or 5th depending on your source. Casablanca, another Moroccan city that overshadows its capital, is the country's most populated, at around 3.5 million, just under 10% of the country's total population. So Rabat is the actual capital, a city which most people probably don't know too much about. It is the country's 7th most populated city with around 1 million people. The city is found on the northwestern coast, some 85 kilometers north of Casablanca. Switzerland's scenario is slightly complex, as the country's constitution doesn't actually specify what its capital city is, so the city of Bern is its de facto capital. With a population of around 130,000, it is the country's 5th most populated. Now, Switzerland has two very well-known cities which would fit perfectly as their capital. You've got Zurich, which is a world-famous city, known for its high quality of life and banking background. It is also the country's most populated city. Then you've got Geneva, another world-famous city, but this time for its importance on the global stage. It is the headquarters of Europe's United Nations and the Red Cross. It's a global hub for diplomacy and banking. Although Bern is a beautiful city, most people who travel to Switzerland would likely skip it in favour of Zurich or one of its many towns or cities in the Alps. South Africa is another weird one, as it is the only country in the world to have not just two capitals but three, those being Cape Town, Pretoria and Bloemfontein. The reason it has three capital cities is that there is one for each branch of the government in the country. The government is divided into three different branches, that's legislative, executive and judicial. It's fair to say that Cape Town is one of the most iconic cities on the continent. However, this really isn't the case for the other two capitals. I'd be very surprised if most people and the general public could tell you a single thing about either of these cities. That's if they even knew they existed. Excluding Cape Town, Johannesburg is arguably the most well-known city in the country. It is the most populated too, with a population of around 5 million. Johannesburg is seen as the country's financial capital and where you'll find the majority of corporate headquarters. South Africa's only stock exchange is also found here. Canada's capital, Ottawa, is easily overshadowed by many other cities in the country, such as Toronto, Montreal and Vancouver, with perhaps a couple of others. Toronto is Canada's most populated and perhaps most famous city. It is responsible for around 20% of the country's entire economy. Some 27 million tourists visit Toronto each year. This is over 3 times more than what visit the capital. Although Ottawa does have some beautiful architecture and is a pretty city, especially during autumn, Toronto is a much bigger city, with huge skyscrapers and that bustling capital city vibe to it. Yet it is not the capital, even if it is commonly mistaken to be. Ottawa has been the capital city of Canada for a long time, in fact since 1867. Nigeria is definitely a contender for the country whose capital city is the most commonly mistaken. Lagos is by far the largest city in the country and in fact the largest city on the continent by population, with around 15 million people living there. The estimated GDP of the city is around $130 billion, the fourth highest in Africa. Most people outside of the country probably couldn't name many other cities in the country, and to be honest, including myself. Abuja, the actual capital, has a population closer to 1 million, so still a decent sized city, although completely dwarfed by Lagos. This 1 million or so population ranks them as the 7th most populated in the country. Another reason why people may think that Lagos is the capital is that it actually used to be, until the planned city of Abuja was constructed in the 1980s, before formally becoming the new capital in 1991. This next one is potentially clutching at straws slightly. So Saudi Arabia's capital city is of course Riyadh. It is by far the most populated city in the country and the country's financial hub. It ticks all of the boxes for a great capital city. However, Saudi Arabia is also home to Mecca, Islam's holiest city, and Islam has around 1.8 billion followers, which makes the city extremely important. However, there is one caveat: only Muslims are allowed into the city. So if a tourist or foreign government official wanted to visit Saudi Arabia and they weren't a Muslim, they could not enter the capital. So in hindsight, maybe Riyadh is the best option. Definitely an interesting one though. And finally, we have Tanzania of East Africa, whose capital city is Dodoma, a city far smaller than its most populated Dar es Salaam. So Dar es Salaam was actually the capital for some time, before being transferred to Dodoma. However, due to its historical importance and size, Dar es Salaam still continues to remain a focus of central government bureaucracy, although this is in the process of transferring to Dodoma. Dar es Salaam's population is somewhere around the 7 million mark, making it the most populated city in the country and the 5th most populated in Africa. From the late 1880s until the end of World War I, Tanzania was actually part of a region known as German East Africa. This region's capital was Dar es Salaam. After Germany's defeat in World War I, the territory was divided among the victorious Allied powers. The region was then placed under British and Belgian administration, eventually leading to the formation of present-day Tanzania, Rwanda and Burundi. There are probably many other examples of countries whose capital city is overshadowed by another or potentially multiple of its other cities. If you can think of any other examples, perhaps your own country's capital, please do drop them in the comments below. And as always, thank you so much for watching today's video.